When my grandmother's will was read, my cousins laughed as they divided up the multi-million-dollar estate. They thought cutting me out completely was their ultimate victory. What they didn't know was that I'd been quietly building something far more valuable than money. A legal network that touched every aspect of their lives. By the time they realized who really held the power, it was already too late. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The mahogany conference table stretched longer than my childhood bedroom, its polished surface reflecting the crystal chandelier that had witnessed 3 generations of Blackwood family meetings. But this wasn't just any family gathering. This was the reading of Eleanor Blackwood's will, and the tension in the room could have powered the entire downtown district. I sat in the corner chair, the one closest to the door, not by choice, but because that's where my cousins had strategically placed me. Like always, I was an afterthought, the family oddball who'd chosen law school over the traditional Blackwood path of real estate development and oil investments. Eleanor Blackwood, my grandmother, had built the family fortune from nothing. She'd started with a single apartment building in 1952 and turned it into a real estate empire spanning 5 states. But more importantly, she'd been the only person in the family who'd ever seen potential in me. "Before we begin," announced Harrison Webb, the family attorney who'd handled Blackwood affairs for 30 years, "I want to remind everyone that Mrs. Blackwood was very specific about her wishes." My cousin Marcus shifted in his chair, already mentally spending his inheritance. At 35, he'd never worked a real job in his life, coasting on family money and connections. His sister Charlotte sat beside him, perfectly manicured fingers drumming against her designer handbag. She'd married into old money and considered herself the family's social ambassador. Then there was Uncle Gerald, my father's brother, who'd always resented that my dad had been Eleanor's favorite son. When my parents died in that car accident, 12 years ago, Gerald had made it clear that I was an unwelcome reminder of his brother's success. "The bulk of Mrs. Blackwood's estate," Webb continued, adjusting his glasses, "including all real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and business interests totaling approximately $47 million, will be divided equally among Marcus Blackwood, Charlotte Blackwood Sterling, and Gerald Blackwood." The room erupted in barely contained celebration. Marcus actually smiled, something I hadn't seen him do since we were children. Charlotte clasped her hands together like she was accepting an award. Uncle Gerald nodded with satisfaction, finally getting what he'd felt entitled to for decades. "As for Riza Blackwood," Webb's voice cut through their quiet celebration, "your grandmother has left you her personal library and a trust fund of $50,000 for educational purposes." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, Marcus started laughing, not the kind of laugh that comes from joy, but the cruel kind that comes from watching someone else's disappointment. "50,000?" he said, wiping fake tears from his eyes. "For the family genius? I spend more than that on my car payments." Charlotte joined in, her laugh higher-pitched and more theatrical. "Well, at least you got the books, Riza. Very fitting." "For someone who's always had her nose in one." Uncle Gerald didn't laugh, but his smile was somehow worse. "I suppose Eleanor finally realized which family members actually contributed to the Blackwood legacy." I sat there, absorbing their mockery, feeling the familiar sting of being the outsider. They saw my silence as defeat, my stillness as shock. What they couldn't see was the phone in my pocket, where I'd just received a text message that changed everything. The message was from James Morrison, senior partner at Morrison, Clark & Associates, the most prestigious law firm in the state. It was simple. "Acquisition complete. Welcome to the big leagues, Riza." You see, while my cousins had been busy spending their trust fund allowances and playing at being important, I'd been building something they couldn't inherit or buy. I'd graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law, spent 5 years at a top-tier firm learning from the best, and then made a move that would have impressed even my grandmother. I'd started my own practice, but not the kind my family expected. Instead of personal injury or family law, I'd specialized in corporate litigation and regulatory compliance. I'd quietly built a client base that included construction companies, zoning boards, environmental agencies, and most importantly, the banks that held mortgages on commercial properties. 3 months ago, I'd made my biggest move yet. Using every connection I'd built, every favor I was owed, and every piece of leverage I'd carefully accumulated, I'd orchestrated the acquisition of Morrison, Clark & Associates. Not as an employee, but as the new majority owner. The irony was perfect. Morrison, Clark & Associates had been the legal counsel for Blackwood Enterprises for over 20 years. They handled every contract, every deal, every legal challenge that came the family's way. And now they answered me. But that was just the beginning. The network I'd built extended far beyond one law firm. I'd cultivated relationships with judges, city council members, state legislators, and federal regulators. I'd done pro bono work for environmental groups and community organizations. I'd volunteered on political campaigns and served on nonprofit boards. While my family saw me as the quiet, bookish disappointment, the legal and political establishment knew me as Reza Blackwood, the brilliant attorney who got things done. Webb finished reading the remaining details of the will, mostly small bequests to household staff and charitable organizations. My relatives were already making plans, talking about property divisions and investment strategies. They'd completely dismissed me, just like they always had. "Well, Reza," Uncle Gerald said as people began to leave, "I suppose you'll need to find a real job now. 50,000 won't last long, even for someone with your modest lifestyle." I stood up slowly, smoothing down my simple black dress. "You're right, Uncle Gerald. 50,000 isn't much these days." Marcus was gathering his papers, probably already calculating how to leverage his inheritance. "Don't worry, cousin. I'm sure there's a nice little law office somewhere that needs a filing clerk." I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. The chandelier cast interesting shadows across their faces, shadows that somehow made them look smaller than I remembered. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying a confidence that made Charlotte look up from her phone, "I should probably mention something. You might want to review your mortgage documents on the downtown properties. There's been some restructuring in the banking sector lately." Gerald's expression shifted slightly. "What are you talking about?" I smiled, the kind of smile my grandmother used to wear when she was about to make a deal that would change everything. "Oh, nothing urgent. Just that Henderson First National, the bank that holds most of your commercial mortgages, was recently acquired. New ownership, new policies. I'm sure it's fine." The room went quiet again, but this time it felt different. Less celebratory. "Also," I continued, "you might want to double-check those environmental compliance reports on the industrial properties. The EPA has been very active lately, and there are some new regulations coming down that could affect older buildings. But I'm sure your legal team has kept you informed about all that." I could see the wheels turning in Uncle Gerald's head. He was the one who actually managed the day-to-day operations of the family business, and he knew exactly which properties I was talking about. "Have a wonderful evening, everyone," I said, walking toward the door. "I have a client meeting in an hour. Big case involving commercial real estate litigation. Nothing you'd be interested in." As I reached the doorway, I heard Charlotte whisper to Marcus, "What did she mean about the bank?" I didn't stay to hear his answer. I had work to do, calls to make, and a family empire to quietly dismantle from the inside out. They thought they'd won by excluding me from grandmother's will. They had no idea that I'd already won a much bigger game. The elevator in the Meridian Tower moved silently toward the 42nd floor, where my newly acquired law firm occupied an entire level of premium office space. Through the glass walls, the city sprawled below like a chessboard, and I was finally ready to make my move. My assistant, Patricia Chen, met me at the elevator with a tablet full of updates. She'd been with Morrison, Clark & Associates for 8 years and had transitioned seamlessly when I took over. Unlike my family, Patricia recognized competence when she saw it. "The Henderson First National acquisition paperwork is finalized," she said, walking beside me toward the corner office that now bore my nameplate. "All Blackwood commercial mortgages are now under your jurisdiction. Also, Senator Williams's office returned your call about the zoning commission appointment." I nodded, settling behind the desk that had once belonged to Harrison Morrison himself. The irony wasn't lost on me. This same desk had hosted countless meetings where my family's legal strategies were planned. Now it was command central for something entirely different. "What's the status of the Riverside Industrial Complex?" I asked, pulling up the files on my computer. Patricia consulted her tablet. "Environmental Protection Agency scheduled their inspection for next Thursday. The preliminary soil samples we requested show significant contamination issues that weren't disclosed in the original property assessments from 1987. Perfect. The Riverside Industrial Complex was Uncle Gerald's crown jewel, a series of manufacturing buildings he'd purchased in the early 90s when environmental regulations were more relaxed. He'd converted them into high-end office spaces and event venues, commanding premium rents from tech companies and marketing firms who loved the industrial chic aesthetic. What Gerald didn't know was that I'd been quietly working with environmental advocacy groups for 3 years, helping them navigate the complex regulatory landscape for pro bono. In return, I'd learned exactly which properties in the city had questionable environmental histories. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Kim, my college roommate, who now worked as an environmental scientist for the state regulatory agency. "Riza, the test results you requested are concerning. We may need to discuss mandatory remediation. Are you representing the property owners?" I smiled, typing back, "In a manner of speaking. Let's schedule a meeting." The beauty of the situation was its elegance. I wasn't breaking any laws or violating any ethical standards. I was simply ensuring that existing regulations were properly enforced. If my family's properties couldn't meet current environmental standards, that was their oversight, not my manipulation. Patricia knocked on the doorframe. "Mrs. Blackwood Sterling is on line 3. She sounds agitated." I picked up the phone, switching to speaker so Patricia could take notes. "Hello, Charlotte." "Riza, what did you mean yesterday about banking restructuring?" Charlotte's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Marcus called Henderson First National this morning, and they said all commercial accounts are under review for compliance with new lending standards." I leaned back in my chair, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the office. "Banking regulations change frequently, Charlotte. It's probably routine." "Routine?" Her voice pitched higher. "They're talking about requiring updated environmental assessments for all properties as collateral. Do you have any idea how expensive that is?" I did know, actually. Environmental assessments for commercial properties could cost anywhere from $50,000 to $500,000, depending on the size and complexity of the site. For a portfolio like my family's, with properties spanning multiple states and decades of questionable maintenance records, the costs would be astronomical. "I'm sure Uncle Gerald has kept excellent records," I said smoothly. "He's always been so thorough about these things." The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know. Gerald was many things, but thorough paperwork wasn't one of them. He'd always relied on the family's legal team to handle the wee details while he focused on deal-making and profit margins. "Riza," Charlotte's voice took on a wheedling tone I remembered from childhood. "You work in law. Can't you recommend someone who specializes in this kind of thing? Someone who might give us a family discount?" I almost laughed. After decades of treating me like an embarrassment, She was asking for my professional help. "I'll see what I can do," I said, which was technically true. What I could do was ensure that every environmental attorney in the city was too busy with other cases to take on Blackwood Enterprises. After Charlotte hung up, Patricia looked up from her notes. "The irony is remarkable." "It gets better," I said, opening another file on my computer. "What's the status of the City Council vote about the historic district expansion?" Councilwoman Rodriguez confirmed the vote is scheduled for next month. The proposed boundaries would include most of downtown, including the Blackwood Tower. The Blackwood Tower was the family's flagship property, a 30-story office building that had been the centerpiece of grandmother's empire. If it became part of the historic district, any renovations or modifications would require approval from the Historic Preservation Committee, a committee that included my former law school professor, Dr. Elizabeth Harper, who'd mentored me through some of my most important academic work. I'd spent months cultivating relationships with historic preservation advocates, attending city, planning meetings, and volunteering for community development projects, not because I was particularly passionate about historic buildings, but because I understood that bureaucracy was the most effective weapon against people who'd never bothered to understand how the system actually worked. My phone rang again. This time it was Marcus, and he didn't bother with pleasantries. "What kind of game are you playing, Riza?" "I'm not sure what you mean," I replied, gesturing for Patricia to start recording the call. My cousin's tendency toward aggressive phone conversations had always been a liability. Don't play dumb. First Charlotte gets spooked about some banking thing, and now I just got a call from my property manager saying there are irregularities with our building permits downtown. Apparently, some of the renovations we did last year might not have been properly approved. I pulled up the permit records on my screen. Marcus had hired the cheapest contractors he could find for those renovations, cutting corners on inspection requirements and using substandard materials, all perfectly legal, as long as the proper paperwork was filed. Unfortunately for Marcus, proper paperwork required attention to detail and patience with bureaucratic processes, two qualities he'd never possessed. "Building permits can be tricky," I said. "Have you considered hiring a compliance specialist to review your documentation?" "I don't need a compliance specialist. I need to know why suddenly everyone's paying attention to paperwork that's been fine for months." I could hear the frustration in his voice, the first cracks in the confidence he'd displayed so smugly at the will reading. "Maybe it's not sudden, Marcus. Maybe you just never noticed before." The truth was, I'd been methodically documenting building code violations, environmental concerns, and permit discrepancies across the family's properties for over 2 years, not to create problems, but to catalog existing ones. Every property owner in the city had similar issues. The difference was that most people addressed them proactively or had legal counsel who stayed on top of regulatory changes. The Blackwood family had always operated under the assumption that money and connections could solve any problem after the fact. They'd never bothered with prevention or compliance because they'd never had to. Grandmother's reputation and the family's political connections had provided a buffer against scrutiny, but reputations fade and political connections shift. The city councilors who'd taken meetings with my grandmother in the 1980s had been replaced by a new generation of politicians who cared more about environmental justice and community development than old money networking. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice level, "I'd be happy to recommend some attorneys who specialize in regulatory compliance. It might be worth having someone review your entire portfolio. We don't need—" He stopped mid-sentence, and I could practically hear him realizing something. "Wait. Didn't you say yesterday that you had a client meeting about commercial real estate litigation?" "I did mention that, yes. Who's the client, Riza?" I smiled, looking out the window at the city that was quickly becoming my chessboard. "I'm afraid that's confidential, Marcus. Attorney-client privilege." After he hung up, Patricia looked up from her laptop where she'd been tracking our family's mounting challenges. The permit violations downtown could trigger a domino effect. If the city requires updated inspections, they'll discover the electrical work that wasn't properly coded. That could lead to temporary closures. And temporary closures affect rental income, I added, which affects their ability to service those newly scrutinized bank loans. Patricia nodded, understanding the elegant precision of the situation I'd constructed. How long have you been planning this? I thought about the question seriously. When did this start? Was it the day my parents died and Uncle Gerald made it clear I was a burden? The countless family gatherings where my cousins treated me like hired help. Will they read where they laughed at my $50,000 inheritance? I think, I said finally. It started the day I realized that being underestimated was the most valuable asset I could have. My computer chimed with a new email from the State Environmental Agency. The subject line read, Riverside Industrial Complex, immediate action required. I opened it, scanning the technical language that would soon cost my family millions in remediation fees. The beautiful thing about environmental law is that it doesn't care about your family name or your political connections. Soil contamination is soil contamination, whether you're worth $50,000 or $50 million, and remediation is expensive for everyone. I forwarded the email to my environmental law specialist with a note. Please ensure all proper notification requirements are followed to the letter. We want to make sure the property owners have every opportunity to comply with regulations. Patricia gathered her files, preparing for our next meeting. What happens when they realize it's you orchestrating all of this? I leaned back in my chair, considering the question. My family was intelligent enough to eventually connect the dots. They'd figure out that I wasn't just some struggling attorney lucky enough to catch their mistakes. They'd realize I'd been systematically documenting their vulnerabilities and positioning myself to exploit them. When they realize it's me, I said, it'll be too late for them to do anything about it. The phone rang again. This time it was Uncle Gerald himself. Uncle Gerald's voice carried the weight of 40 years in business, but for the first time since I'd known him, it also carried uncertainty. Riza, we need to talk. Can you meet me at the office tomorrow morning? I glanced at Patricia, who was already pulling up Gerald's calendar conflicts on her tablet. My assistant had become remarkably efficient at anticipating the family's desperation. I'm pretty booked this week, I said, which was true. Managing the systematic dismantling of a family empire required careful scheduling. What's this regarding? You know damn well what it's regarding. Gerald's composure cracked slightly. These regulatory issues aren't coincidental, and I'm starting to think you know more about what's happening than you're letting on. I had to admire his instincts. Gerald might have been ruthless and dismissive, but he wasn't stupid. He'd built his portion of the family business through shrewd deal-making and an ability to read people's motivations. Unfortunately for him, he'd never bothered to really read me. Uncle Gerald, I'm just a lawyer. I don't control banking regulations or environmental agencies. No, but you understand them better than anyone else in the family. His voice took on a tone I'd never heard before, something approaching respect. Look, maybe we've had our differences, but we're still family. If you know something that could help us navigate this situation, I'm willing to listen. Patricia held up her tablet, showing me Gerald's appointment calendar for the next 3 days. It was a parade of emergency meetings with accountants, property managers, and what appeared to be several different law firms. He was scrambling, trying to put out fires that kept multiplying faster than he could contain them. I suppose I could move some things around, I said finally. How about Thursday at 10? We can meet at the Meridian Tower. The pause on Gerald's end told me everything. He'd been expecting to meet on his territory, in the familiar conference room where the family had always conducted business. The idea of coming to my office, the office he didn't even know I owned, represented a fundamental shift in our dynamic. Fine, he said. Thursday at 10. After hanging up, I turned to Patricia. Status report on the West Side shopping complex? The state fire inspector completed his review yesterday. The sprinkler system installed in 1994 doesn't meet current codes, and the emergency exits were never properly certified after the 2018 renovations. Patricia scrolled through her notes. Estimated cost for compliance, $800,000 to $1.2 million, depending on whether they need to reconfigure the tenant spaces. The West Side shopping complex was Charlotte's baby, her attempt to prove she could manage a major property independently. She'd inherited it through her marriage and spent the last 5 years positioning herself as the family's retail real estate expert. The complex housed everything from high-end boutiques to a popular restaurant that had been featured in several lifestyle magazines. What Charlotte hadn't realized was that retail properties faced some of the strictest safety regulations. In the industry, every renovation, every tenant modification, every cosmetic change required multiple inspections and certifications. She'd been so focused on the aesthetics and profit margins that she'd treated safety compliance as an afterthought. I'd learned about the fire safety issues 6 months ago when I'd done pro bono legal work for a restaurant workers' union. They'd been concerned about safety conditions at various establishments around the city, and I'd helped them understand how to request official inspections. The West Side complex had been one of several properties flagged for review. What about the tax assessment appeals? I asked. Patricia's expression grew almost sympathetic. The county assessor's office completed their revaluation of all downtown commercial properties. The family's total tax liability is increasing by approximately 40% effective next fiscal year. Perfect. Property tax assessments were one of those invisible forces that most people ignored until they became a crisis. Commercial property owners could appeal assessments they felt were unfair, but the appeal process required detailed documentation, professional appraisals, and often legal representation. My family had always relied on their political connections to keep assessments reasonable. A word here, a donation there, and suddenly your property taxes remained manageable even as surrounding values skyrocketed. But political connections only work when you maintain them, and the family had been coasting on grandmother's relationships for years without building new ones. Meanwhile, I'd been volunteering with community development organizations that advocated for fair property tax distribution. I'd helped draft policy recommendations for more accurate commercial assessments and worked with the assessor's office to implement new evaluation methodologies, not to target my family specifically, but to ensure that all property owners paid their fair share. The fact that fair enforcement happened to devastate the family's cash flow was simply a happy coincidence. My phone buzzed with a text message from Judge Catherine Torres, whom I'd worked with on several environmental justice cases over the past 3 years. Riza, heads up. Blackwood Enterprises just filed for an emergency injunction to delay the Riverside remediation requirements. Hearing scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. You might find this interesting. I showed the message to Patricia, who immediately began pulling up the relevant case files. An emergency injunction was a desperate move, the legal equivalent of throwing yourself on the mercy of the court when you had no other options. They're asking Judge Torres to delay the environmental cleanup requirements, Patricia said, scanning the filing documents. Their argument is that the contamination predates current regulations and shouldn't be subject to retroactive enforcement. I almost felt sorry for whoever was representing my family. The argument wasn't entirely without merit. Retroactive environmental enforcement could be challenged under certain circumstances, but Judge Torres had built her career on environmental law and had zero patience for property owners who tried to avoid cleanup responsibilities on technical grounds. More importantly, I'd helped research and draft several of the precedent cases that would likely be cited in this hearing. The legal framework that would be used to deny my family's injunction request was partially my own work. Send flowers to Judge Torres's office, I told Patricia. Something tasteful for her anniversary. I believe it's next week, Patricia made a note. The same arrangement we sent last year? Perfect. And make sure to include a card mentioning how much I've enjoyed our collaboration on environmental advocacy projects. The beauty of this approach was its subtlety. I wasn't trying to influence the judge's decision. Her ruling would be based entirely on legal precedent and environmental regulations. But I was ensuring that she remembered our professional relationship and the work we'd done together to strengthen environmental protections. When Judge Torres saw my family's attorneys arguing that environmental regulations shouldn't apply retroactively, she'd remember the cases where I'd argued the opposite position. She'd remember the research briefs I'd provided and the community impact studies I'd helped coordinate. She'd see my family's legal strategy for what it was, an attempt to avoid responsibility for decades of environmental neglect. My computer chimed with an email from the city planning department. The subject line read, "Historic District Expansion. Final vote scheduled." I opened it, scanning the details that would seal another aspect of my family's fate. The Blackwood Tower, their flagship property, would officially become part of the city's historic district next month. Any exterior modifications would require approval from the Historic Preservation Committee. Any interior renovations affecting the building's structural integrity would need additional oversight. Most importantly, the historic designation would trigger a comprehensive review of all previous modifications to ensure they met preservation standards. Given that Marcus had spent the last 2 years modernizing the building with cheap renovations and trendy design elements, the review would likely require extensive and expensive restoration work. I'd been working with the Historic Preservation Society for 18 months, volunteering my legal expertise to help them navigate complex zoning regulations and property rights issues. In return, I'd learned exactly which buildings in the downtown area had the most historic significance and the strongest cases for preservation status. The Blackwood Tower, built in 1962 and representing a perfect example of mid-century modern commercial architecture, was an obvious candidate for protection. The fact that protecting it would create massive financial headaches for my family was simply good urban planning. Patricia knocked on my doorframe. "Your 3 o'clock appointment is here." Detective Ray Sullivan from the White Collar Crime Division entered my office with the careful demeanor of someone who'd spent years investigating financial irregularities. I'd worked with him on several cases involving corporate fraud and regulatory violations. "Riza, thanks for making time," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something that might affect your family." I kept my expression neutral, though my pulse quickened slightly. "What kind of something?" "We've received several complaints about potential insurance fraud involving commercial properties downtown. Nothing concrete yet, but the pattern suggests someone's been filing inflated claims for renovation work and emergency repairs." He pulled out a small notebook. "Have you heard anything through your legal practice that might be relevant?" I thought, carefully before responding. Insurance fraud was serious business, and I had no desire to cross legal or ethical boundaries, even in pursuit of justice for my family's treatment. "I haven't heard anything specific," I said, "but I know that some property owners have been struggling with increased regulatory requirements lately. It's possible that financial pressure could lead to questionable decisions." Sullivan nodded. "That's what we're thinking. When people get desperate, they sometimes make poor choices about how to fund compliance requirements." He closed his notebook. "If you hear anything concrete, you know how to reach me." After he left, I sat quietly for several minutes, contemplating the expanding web of consequences surrounding my family's empire. I hadn't reported them for insurance fraud because I didn't know if they'd committed any. But if they had, and given their recent financial pressures it was certainly possible, that was a problem they'd created entirely on their own. Patricia appeared in my doorway again. "Mrs. Blackwood Sterling called while you were in your meeting. She'd like to move up her lunch appointment with you from next week." I smiled, checking my calendar. Charlotte was getting desperate enough to seek my help directly. The lunch she'd requested, our first social interaction in over 5 years, represented complete capitulation of her previous dismissive attitude. "Tell her I can fit her in tomorrow at noon." Make reservations somewhere nice. I think it's time for a family reunion. The Michelin-starred restaurant overlooked the harbor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that had graced countless business deal celebrations over the decades. Charlotte arrived 15 minutes early, a first in our family history, and I could see her fidgeting with her jewelry from across the dining room. She'd chosen her outfit carefully. Understated elegance designed to convey both respect and authority. The Hermès bag, the Cartier watch, the perfectly coordinated ensemble that screamed old money sophistication. What she didn't realize was that her desperate phone calls over the past week had already undermined any authority she hoped to project. "Riza," she said, standing to embrace me as I approached the table. The hug was awkward, unfamiliar. We hadn't had physical contact since we were children. "You look wonderful. That suit is gorgeous." I thanked her, noting how she'd already ordered wine without waiting for me. Charlotte had always been a nervous drinker, and the half-empty glass suggested she'd been rehearsing this conversation in her head for hours. "I ordered the Chateau Margaux," she said, attempting casual sophistication. "I remember you always had good taste in wine." I didn't have the heart to tell her that I rarely drank wine, and that she was probably thinking of someone else entirely. Instead, I smiled and let her pour me a glass, watching as she tried to find the right way to begin what was clearly a prepared speech. "I want to apologize," she said finally, "for how things went at the will reading. Family dynamics can be complicated, and I think we all said things we didn't mean." Interesting approach. Charlotte was trying to reframe the decades of dismissive treatment as a temporary family squabble rather than the systematic exclusion it had actually been. She was also speaking carefully, like someone who suspected the conversation might be monitored or recorded. "Apology accepted," I said, cutting into the conversation before she could build momentum. "What's really going on, Charlotte?" Her composure slipped slightly. She'd prepared for denials, justifications, maybe even some negotiation. She hadn't prepared for direct confrontation. "The shopping complex is having some regulatory issues," she said, taking a larger sip of wine. "Nothing serious, but the compliance costs are significant. I thought maybe you could recommend someone who specializes in retail property law." I studied her face, noting the fine lines around her eyes that suggested several sleepless nights. Charlotte had always prided herself on her appearance, and the fact that she looked tired meant the stress was overwhelming her usual vanity. "What kind of regulatory issues?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Fire safety compliance, mostly. Some of the installations from our renovations apparently don't meet current standards." She laughed nervously. "It's ridiculous, really. The complex has been operating safely for years, but bureaucrats love their paperwork." The dismissive attitude was classic Charlotte. When confronted with problems she couldn't control through money or connections, she defaulted to contempt for the system itself. It was the same attitude that had led to these problems in the first place. "Fire safety regulations exist for good reasons," I said mildly. "How many people work in the complex on a daily basis?" "About 300, between all the stores and the restaurant." She seemed puzzled by the question. "But that's not the point. The point is that these requirements are being enforced retroactively, which seems unfair." I nodded, sipping my wine while calculating. 300 people working, in a building with substandard fire safety equipment, plus however many customers visited daily. If something went wrong, an electrical fire, a kitchen accident, any emergency requiring rapid evacuation, the consequences could be catastrophic. Charlotte's paperwork complaint suddenly sounded less like bureaucratic overreach and more like willful negligence. "The enforcement isn't retroactive," I explained gently. "Fire safety codes are updated regularly, and property owners are required to maintain compliance with current standards." "When was the last time you had a comprehensive safety inspection?" Her expression told me she didn't know. Charlotte had inherited a profitable property and focused entirely on maximizing revenue without understanding the operational requirements that made that revenue possible. "I don't handle the day-to-day maintenance issues," she said defensively. "I have people for that." "What did your people tell you about fire safety compliance when you planned the renovations?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Charlotte was realizing that she'd been asking the wrong questions and trusting the wrong people for years. Her property managers had likely cut corners on safety inspections to keep costs down, assuming they could address problems if and when they were discovered. "Look," she said, leaning forward with a desperation that made me almost feel sorry for her. "I know we haven't been as close as we should have been, but we're family, and family helps family. I'm willing to pay fair market rates for legal services. I just need someone who understands how to work with regulatory agencies." I set down my wine glass, considering her request. Charlotte was offering to hire me, not as a favor or charity case, but as a legitimate attorney charging legitimate fees. It was the first time in our lives that she'd acknowledged my professional competence. "Who's representing you currently?" I asked. "Morrison, Clark and Associates has been handling our legal work for years," she said, "but they seem overwhelmed lately. Every time I call, they're dealing with some crisis or another, and I can't get anyone to focus on my issues." I almost smiled. Morrison, Clark and Associates was overwhelmed because they were now working for me, and I'd been keeping them busy with cases that served my broader strategic goals. Charlotte's fire safety crisis was just another item on their increasingly impossible workload. "I might be able to recommend someone," I said carefully. "But first, I need to understand the full scope of the problems. Are we talking about just the fire safety issues, or are there other compliance concerns?" Charlotte looked around the restaurant, nervously, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "There might be some tax assessment issues as well. The county apparently wants to revalue all commercial properties downtown, which could significantly increase our obligations." "How significantly?" "Potentially 40% or more." She finished her wine in one gulp. "Combined with the fire safety compliance costs, we're looking at well over $1 million in unexpected expenses this year." I understood now why Charlotte had swallowed her pride to ask for my help. The shopping complex that had been her pride and joy, her proof that she could succeed independently of family connections, was about to become a financial disaster that could destroy her marriage and her social status. "There's something else," she said, lowering her voice even further. "Marcus is having similar problems with his properties, and Uncle Gerald is dealing with some kind of environmental situation. It's like the entire family business is under attack simultaneously." She paused, studying my face carefully. "You don't seem surprised by any of this." I met her gaze steadily, letting the silence build tension. Charlotte was intelligent enough to suspect that these problems weren't coincidental, but she didn't yet understand the scope of what was happening. "Regulatory enforcement tends to happen in waves," I said finally. "When agencies get new leadership or funding, they often launch comprehensive review initiatives. It's not unusual for multiple properties to face scrutiny at the same time." Was a technically accurate explanation that revealed nothing about my role in coordinating that scrutiny. Charlotte nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. "Riza," she said, "I need to ask you something directly. Do you know anything about why all these problems are surfacing now?" The question hung between us like a challenge. Charlotte was giving me an opportunity to come clean, to admit my involvement and potentially negotiate some kind of resolution. She was also testing whether I had the courage to own my actions. I thought about my parents, who had died when I was 22 and left me alone with a family that saw me as an obligation rather than a member. I thought about my grandmother's funeral, where my cousins had spent more time discussing their inheritance than mourning her death. I thought about the will reading, where they'd laughed at my $50,000 bequest like it was a joke. "Charlotte," I said, "I think you're giving me too much credit. I'm just a lawyer who understands regulatory compliance. I didn't create these problems. I just recognize them when I see them." She stared at me for a long moment, processing my non-answer. But you could help us solve them? I could certainly try. But solutions require understanding how these problems developed in the first place. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Charlotte's face went pale. She was beginning to understand that hiring me might involve uncomfortable revelations about her own negligence and poor decision-making. Legal solutions often required admitting mistakes that clients preferred to keep hidden. What would that scrutiny involve? She asked. Full audits of all property maintenance records, comprehensive reviews of contractor work, detailed analysis of permit applications and inspection reports, coordination with multiple regulatory agencies. I paused, letting the implications sink in. Transparency, Charlotte. Complete transparency. She signaled the waiter for another bottle of wine, buying time to process what I'd told her. Charlotte had spent her adult life maintaining carefully constructed facades. The successful businesswoman, the sophisticated socialite, the competent property manager. Full transparency would demolish those facades and force her to confront her actual capabilities. And if we agreed to that level of scrutiny, she said slowly, you could resolve these regulatory issues? I smiled, the same smile I'd learned from watching grandmother negotiate deals that seemed impossible. Charlotte, I can't promise to resolve anything, but I can promise that if you hire me, you'll understand exactly what you're dealing with and what your options are. She nodded slowly, understanding that I was offering competence rather than miracles. For the first time in her life, Charlotte was being forced to choose between comfortable delusions and effective solutions. I'll need to discuss this with my husband, she said, and probably with Uncle Gerald and Marcus. This affects all of us. Of course. Take all the time you need. I stood up, signaling the end of our lunch. But Charlotte, these regulatory issues don't pause for family discussions. Every day you delay addressing them is another day of accumulating liability. As I walked away from the table, I could feel her watching me, trying to reconcile the quiet, bookish cousin she remembered with the confident attorney who'd just offered to save her business. She was beginning to understand that she'd fundamentally misjudged me. What she didn't yet understand was that saving her business would require destroying the version of herself she'd spent decades creating. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of gray Seattle drizzle that made the city's glass towers look like tombstones against the sky. I watched from my office window as Uncle Gerald's Mercedes pulled into the Meridian Tower parking garage 20 minutes early, another first in family history. Patricia had prepared a comprehensive briefing folder that now sat on my desk like a weapon waiting to be deployed. 2 years of careful documentation, regulatory filings, correspondence with government agencies, and financial projections that painted a devastating picture of the Blackwood Empire's actual condition. He's in the elevator, Patricia announced, monitoring the security feeds from her desk. And he's not alone. Marcus is with him. Interesting. Gerald bringing Marcus suggested this wasn't just a reconnaissance mission. They were planning some kind of coordinated approach. Perhaps they'd finally realized that their individual crises were connected. The elevator chimed, and I heard Patricia's professional greeting as she directed them to the conference room. I waited 30 seconds before joining them, letting them absorb the reality of my new environment. The conference room was deliberately intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, a table that could seat 20, and walls lined with framed legal victories that demonstrated the firm's capabilities. Gerald and Marcus sat at the far end, looking smaller than usual in the oversized space. Uncle Gerald, Marcus, I said, settling into the chair at the head of the table. Thank you for coming. Can Patricia get you anything? Coffee? Water? Gerald shook his head curtly. He'd dressed for battle in his most expensive suit, but the effect was undermined by the stress lines around his eyes and the way his hands fidgeted with his briefcase. Marcus looked worse. His usual cocky demeanor had been replaced by something approaching panic. and he kept checking his phone like he was expecting more bad news at any moment. "Riza," Gerald began, his voice carrying the authority he'd wielded over family business for decades. "We need to understand what's happening. These regulatory issues affecting our properties aren't random coincidences." I opened the folder Patricia had prepared, spreading several documents across the table. "What makes you think they're not random?" "Because," Marcus interjected, "in 30 years of business, we've never faced this level of scrutiny from multiple agencies simultaneously. It's like someone threw a switch and suddenly every bureaucrat in the city decided to audit our operations." I studied the documents in front of me: environmental reports, building code violations, fire safety citations, tax assessment increases. Each represented a legitimate regulatory concern that had existed for months or years before enforcement began. "Maybe," I said carefully, "the switch that got thrown was accountability. These aren't new problems, Marcus. They're old problems that nobody bothered to address." Gerald's expression hardened. "Don't lecture us about accountability, Riza. We've been running successful businesses since before you graduated law school." "Have you?" I pulled out a financial analysis that showed the family's actual cash flow versus their debt obligations. Because looking at these numbers, I'm not sure successful is the right word. The silence that followed was profound. Neither Gerald nor Marcus had expected me to have access to their detailed financial information. They were beginning to understand that my knowledge of their situation went far beyond casual observation. "How did you get those documents?" Gerald asked quietly. "Banking compliance reviews are public record when they involve commercial loans over certain thresholds," I explained. "Environmental assessments become public when they're filed with regulatory agencies. Building permits and inspection reports are available through city records requests." I spread additional papers across the table. "Tax assessments are public. Insurance claims are discoverable through FOIA requests when they involve properties that receive municipal services. Court filings are always public." Marcus stared at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. "You've been investigating us?" "I've been reading public records," I corrected. "The difference is that investigation implies hidden information. Everything I'm showing you has been publicly available for months. You just never bothered to look." Gerald picked up one of the environmental reports, scanning the technical language that described decades of contamination at the Riverside Industrial Complex. "Even if these problems existed, why are they all being enforced now?" It was the right question, and Gerald deserved an honest answer. I leaned back in my chair, considering how much truth to reveal. "Because," I said finally, "someone who understands regulatory compliance has been ensuring that existing laws are properly enforced. Environmental protection, worker safety, building codes, tax equity. These aren't new regulations. They're old regulations that haven't been consistently applied." Marcus's phone buzzed, and his face went white as he read the message. "The City Planning Commission just rejected our appeal for the Blackwood Tower renovations. They're saying we need to restore the original facade elements." I nodded sympathetically. "Historic preservation is important for maintaining the city's architectural character." "Historic preservation?" Gerald's voice rose. "That building is 60 years old. Since when is 1960s architecture considered historic?" "Since the National Register of Historic Places added mid-century modern commercial buildings to their protected categories," I replied. "The guidelines were updated 18 months ago." Gerald stared at me with growing suspicion. "And you just happen to know about this update?" "I stay current with regulatory changes that affect commercial real estate. It's part of my job." I pulled out another document. "I also stay current with zoning ordinances, environmental regulations, labor law updates, and municipal code revisions." Marcus set down his phone, his hands shaking slightly. "How much is this going to cost us?" I consulted the financial projections Patricia had prepared. "Environmental remediation at Riverside, 3 to 5 million. Fire safety compliance at the shopping complex, 800,000 to 1.2 million. Historic preservation requirements. For the Blackwood Tower, approximately 2 million. Updated tax assessments across all properties, an additional 1.8 million annually. The numbers hit them like physical blows. Gerald's face went gray, and Marcus actually put his head in his hands. That's assuming, I continued, that you can address everything through compliance rather than litigation. Legal fees could add another million or more, depending on how aggressively you want to fight. Fight what? Gerald asked. You just told us these are legitimate regulatory requirements. They are. But you could challenge the enforcement timeline, appeal the assessment valuations, or request hardship exemptions for some of the compliance costs. I closed the folder. Of course, litigation would require proving that enforcement is unreasonable, which might be difficult given the documentation trail. Marcus looked up. What documentation trail? I smiled, the expression my grandmother used to wear when she was about to reveal the true scope of a business deal. The trail shows that your family has been notified about these compliance issues repeatedly over the past 2 years, but chose to ignore them. I pulled out a thick stack of correspondence, letters from environmental agencies, notices from building inspectors, warnings from fire safety officials, requests for updated documentation from tax assessors. Every regulatory agency involved in your current problems has been trying to work with you for months, I said, spreading the letters across the table. They sent notifications. They offered consultation services. They provided compliance assistance. Programs. Gerald picked up one of the letters, dated 8 months earlier. I never saw this. Because, I said gently, your legal counsel received them and filed them away without taking action. Your property managers received them and assumed someone else would handle them. Your accountants received them and categorized them as routine correspondence. The realization was dawning on both of them. Their business empire had been built on delegation and assumption rather than direct oversight. They'd trusted other people to handle details they considered beneath their attention, and those people had failed them systematically. Who was supposed to be managing these compliance issues? Marcus asked. Morrison, Clark & Associates handled regulatory correspondence, I replied, but they were only copying your property management companies, who were supposed to coordinate with your maintenance contractors, who were supposed to communicate with your insurance agents. I pulled out an organizational chart showing the tangled web of responsibility that had allowed problems to compound for years. Nobody had overall authority to ensure compliance, so everybody assumed somebody else was handling it. Gerald stared at the chart with growing horror. This is a disaster. It's worse than a disaster, I said quietly. It's a pattern of systematic negligence that could have legal consequences beyond just compliance costs. Marcus looked up sharply. What kind of legal consequences? I hesitated, knowing that my next words would change the family dynamic forever. Personal liability, criminal negligence, potential fraud charges if it appears that compliance failures were deliberate attempts to avoid costs. The conference room fell silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows. Gerald and Marcus were processing the reality that their financial problems might be the least of their concerns. Riza, Gerald said slowly, we need your help. It was the first time in my life that Uncle Gerald had asked me for anything. The man who'd made it clear that I was a burden on the family, who'd dismissed my career choices and excluded me from business decisions, was now admitting that he needed my expertise. I'm listening, I said. We need legal representation. Someone who understands regulatory compliance and can negotiate with these agencies. He paused, the words clearly difficult for him. We need someone the agencies trust and respect. I stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the harbor where my grandmother had built her first apartment building 70 years ago. The irony was perfect. The family that had excluded me from their empire was now begging me to save it. "I'll need full disclosure," I said without turning around. "Complete access to all financial records, property management files, and business correspondence. No secrets, no hidden information, no attempts to manage my representation." "Done," Gerald said immediately. "I'll need decision-making authority for all compliance matters. No second-guessing, no committee discussions, no family politics interfering with legal strategy." "Agreed." I turned back to face them. "And I'll need payment in advance. $2 million retainer held in escrow to cover legal fees and compliance costs." The sum was staggering, more money than my family had ever paid for legal services, more than they'd probably paid for legal representation in their entire history combined. Gerald didn't hesitate. "Done." I smiled, realizing that they still didn't understand the true scope of what was happening. They thought they were hiring an attorney to solve their regulatory problems. They didn't realize they were surrendering control of their empire to the person they'd spent decades underestimating. 3 months after Uncle Gerald signed the retainer, agreement that gave me complete authority over the family's legal strategy, I stood in the same mahogany-paneled conference room where Grandmother's will had been read. But this time, the power dynamic had shifted so fundamentally that the room itself seemed different. Gerald sat across from me, his expensive suit hanging loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds from stress. Marcus slumped in his chair, staring at financial documents that told a story he still couldn't fully comprehend. Charlotte had arrived 15 minutes late, her usual precision replaced by the distracted air of someone juggling too many crises. "The environmental remediation at Riverside is complete," I announced, consulting the tablet that had replaced the family's traditional paper files. "Total cost, $4.2 million. The site is now certified clean and can be developed according to current environmental standards." Gerald nodded mechanically. The man who'd once prided himself on his business acumen now relied entirely on my summaries to understand his own company's status. "The Westside shopping complex has passed all fire safety inspections," I continued. "The upgrades cost $1.1 million, but the complex is now rated as one of the safest retail properties in the state. Insurance premiums have actually decreased by 30%. Charlotte managed a weak smile. The shopping complex that had nearly bankrupted her was now more valuable than ever, but she no longer owned it. The compliance costs had forced her to sell majority control to a consortium of investors who happened to be clients of my law firm. "The Blackwood Tower restoration is ahead of schedule," I said. "The historic preservation work has uncovered some remarkable original features that will actually increase the building's architectural significance." Marcus looked up from his documents. "How much is this costing us again?" "The restoration itself cost $2.8 million, I replied. "But the historic designation has increased the property's assessed value by $12 million. When you factor in the tax incentives for historic preservation, you'll actually show a net profit of approximately $3 million over 5 years." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The historic designation that Marcus had fought so desperately was the only thing keeping the Blackwood Tower financially viable. "What about the tax assessments?" Gerald asked. "Resolved through the hardship mitigation program. Instead of a 40% increase, your total tax liability across all properties will increase by only 8% over 3 years. I set down my tablet. "You'll save approximately $2.1 million compared to the original assessments." I'd spent 2 months negotiating with the county assessor's office, using my relationships with community development organizations to demonstrate that the family was committed to responsible property management. The key had been showing concrete evidence of compliance improvements rather than simply complaining about increased costs. "So, where does that leave us financially?" Charlotte asked. I pulled up the comprehensive analysis that Patricia had spent weeks preparing. Total compliance costs, $8.3 million. Total increased property values from improvements, $18.7 million. Net increase in family wealth, $10.4 million. The silence that followed was profound. They'd spent 3 months convinced that the regulatory enforcement would destroy their business empire. Instead, forced compliance had made them significantly wealthier. But, Gerald said slowly, we had to mortgage everything to cover the compliance costs. You mortgaged everything because your cash flow management was catastrophic, I corrected gently. You were carrying debt at high interest rates while keeping money in low-yield investments. The compliance costs just forced you to rationalize your financial structure. I showed them the debt consolidation analysis that had streamlined their borrowing from 17 different loans to 3 major mortgages with better terms. Your annual debt service has actually decreased by $1.2 million per year. Marcus shook, his head in bewilderment. If this is such a good outcome, why does it feel like we lost everything? The question struck to the heart of what had really happened. They hadn't lost money. They'd lost control. Every aspect of their business empire now operated under systems I'd implemented, with oversight I'd established, according to standards I'd negotiated. You lost the illusion of control, I said. For decades, you operated under the assumption that success meant avoiding accountability. Now you understand that real success requires meeting it. I walked to the window that overlooked the harbor, watching the construction crews working on the waterfront development project that would transform the city's skyline over the next decade. It was a project that would create thousands of jobs, generate millions in tax revenue, and establish new standards for sustainable urban development. It was also a project that my firm was managing, using the relationships and expertise I'd built, while supposedly just helping my family with compliance issues. There's something else we need to discuss, I said, turning back to face them. Gerald's expression tensed. After 3 months of surprises, he'd learned to fear my announcements. The Morrison, Clark & Associates merger is being finalized next week. The combined firm will be one of the largest legal practices on the West Coast, specializing in regulatory, compliance, and sustainable development. Charlotte looked confused. What merger? My firm is acquiring Morrison, Clark & Associates, I explained. They'll become a subsidiary focused on traditional commercial law, while we expand into environmental and regulatory specialties. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Morrison, Clark & Associates had been their legal counsel for 20 years. They'd trusted Harrison Webb and his partners with their most sensitive business decisions. Now they were learning that their longtime lawyers had been working for me all along. When did this happen? Marcus asked. The acquisition began 18 months ago, I said. It was completed last month. Gerald stared at me with something approaching awe. You've been planning this for over a year? I've been planning this since I was 22 years old, I replied. Since the day you made it clear that I would never be considered a real member of this family. I returned to my seat, pulling out a document that would finalize the transformation I'd spent years orchestrating. The Blackwood Family Trust is being restructured, I announced. All properties will be transferred to a new holding company that prioritizes sustainable development and community investment. I slid the papers across the table. You'll retain your current income levels, but future profits will be reinvested in environmental restoration, affordable housing, and community development projects. Charlotte picked up the documents, scanning the legal language that redefined their entire legacy. What does this mean for our ownership? You'll be limited partners with guaranteed income, but no operational control. All business decisions will be made by the general partner. I paused, letting the implications sink in. That general partner is me. The silence stretched for several minutes as they absorbed the reality of what I'd accomplished. I hadn't just solved their regulatory problems. I'd used those problems to justify taking complete control of their empire. This is extortion, Marcus said finally. No, I replied calmly. This is the consequence. You had 2 choices when these compliance issues emerged. Address them responsibly or face criminal liability for willful negligence. You chose to ask, me to handle them, and this is how I've chosen to handle them. I pulled out the insurance fraud investigation that Detective Sullivan had been conducting. Did you know that Marcus filed claims for emergency repairs that were actually code violations you'd been ignoring for years? Or that Charlotte claimed tax deductions for unforeseen regulatory costs while sitting on compliance notices for months? Their faces went white as they realized how close they'd come to serious criminal charges. I convinced the insurance companies that these were mistakes rather than deliberate fraud, I continued. I persuaded the tax authorities that the deductions were legitimate given the circumstances. I provided documentation showing that you were working in good faith to address compliance issues. Gerald found his voice. In exchange for control of the business. In exchange for ensuring that this family's legacy becomes something worth preserving, I corrected. Grandmother built this empire to create opportunities and improve communities. You turned it into a machine for extracting profit while avoiding responsibility. I stood up, gathering my papers. Under my management, the Blackwood name will be associated with sustainable development, environmental restoration, and community investment. Your children and grandchildren will inherit something they can be proud of. Charlotte looked up from the restructuring documents. What if we refuse to sign this? Then you can hire new legal counsel to defend against insurance fraud charges, tax evasion allegations, and criminal negligence claims. I smiled the same smile grandmother had worn when she was being absolutely ruthless. Of course, you'll need to find attorneys who aren't conflicted by their relationship with my firm. The threat was clear. I now controlled the legal landscape. They operated in so completely that finding independent representation would be nearly impossible. Marcus slumped in his chair. How did we not see this coming? Because, I said, you never bothered to understand what I was actually capable of. You saw me as the quiet, bookish disappointment who wasn't worth your attention. You never realized that being underestimated was the most valuable asset I could have. I walked toward the door, then paused to deliver the final revelation that would cement my victory. The $50,000 grandmother left me in her will? I used it as seed money to start my practice 5 years ago. Every investment I made, every relationship I built, every case I took, it all started with that money you laughed at. Gerald's expression shifted to something like respect. She knew. She knew exactly what she was doing, I confirmed. Grandmother understood that I would need resources to build something independent of the family business. She also knew that you would never accept me as an equal partner unless I could prove my value by saving you from yourselves. I opened the conference room door, then looked back at the 3 people who had shaped my life through their neglect and dismissal. You have 72 hours to review the restructuring documents. Patricia will schedule signing appointments at your convenience. I paused, choosing my final words carefully. Welcome to the new Blackwood family legacy. As I walked through, the offices that had once intimidated me with their displays of wealth and power, I reflected on the elegant symmetry of what I'd accomplished. I'd used their own negligence against them, their own systems to control them, their own desperate need for my expertise to justify taking everything they'd built. But most importantly, I'd proven that intelligence and patience could overcome decades of dismissal and exclusion. They'd thought they were protecting their empire by keeping me out. Instead, they'd created the perfect conditions for me to take it over completely. Patricia was waiting in my office with the final contracts that would make the transformation official. How did they take it? Like people who finally understand that actions have consequences, I replied, settling behind the desk that represented everything I'd achieved. Any word from the mayor's office about the waterfront development project? Approved unanimously. Construction begins next month. Patricia smiled. The city council was impressed by our commitment to environmental sustainability and community investment. I nodded, looking out at the harbor where grandmother had started with a single apartment building. In 2 generations, the Blackwood name had gone from immigrant ambition to old money arrogance to something entirely new, a force for responsible development and community benefit. My phone buzzed with a text from Charlotte. "We'll sign the documents, but I want you to know that I finally understand what grandmother saw in you." I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I opened the desk drawer where I kept the personal letter grandmother had left for me, separate from her official will. I'd read it dozens of times over the past few months, but the words still carried power. "Riza, if you're reading this, it means the family has finally pushed you far enough to claim what was always yours by right. Don't let them make you feel guilty for being smarter than they are. They excluded you because they feared what you might accomplish if given the chance. Prove them right to be afraid. Build something better. Eleanor." I looked up to find Patricia watching me with concern. "Everything all right?" "Everything," I said, closing the drawer and returning to the contracts that would reshape my family's legacy, "is exactly as it should be." The rain had stopped, and afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the signature page that would make official what everyone in the room had already understood. The Blackwood Empire belonged to me now, and I intended to use it to build something that would outlast us all. In the end, they hadn't just underestimated my capabilities. They'd fundamentally misunderstood what victory looked like. They'd thought winning meant excluding me from their world. I'd understood that real victory meant making their world irrelevant by building a better one. The family that had thought they'd won by cutting me out of grandmother's will had just discovered that I'd already inherited something far more valuable than money. The power to determine what the Blackwood name would mean for generations to come. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.